Sometimes evil does not wear a mask. Sometimes it hides behind a quiet afternoon that feels too peaceful to question. The September air drifts gently through the towering pine trees outside the small Montana town, where 16-year-old Grace Walker walks along a familiar forest trail with the only family she has left. Ranger, her loyal black and tan German shepherd, moves a few feet ahead with calm confidence, his ears lifting whenever the breeze carries the scent of deer, wildflowers, or the distant creek that winds through the valley below. Golden sunlight filters through the branches, painting moving patches of light across the narrow dirt path, while fallen pine needles soften every step beneath Grace's worn hiking boots. She smiles as Ranger pauses beside a weathered log and looks back at her, waiting without impatience, as though he has always understood that the journey matters more than the destination. Ever since losing her parents 3 years earlier, these quiet walks have become their promise to one another. Every Saturday afternoon, no matter the season, they leave behind the noise of town and disappear into the forest where memories hurt a little less and silence somehow feels comforting instead of lonely. Grace reaches into her jacket pocket and pulls out a small tennis ball, holding it high with a playful grin. Ranger immediately straightens, his tail sweeping slowly through the cool mountain air while his warm brown eyes never leave her hand. She laughs softly and pretends to throw it before hiding it behind her back. The old game never stops working. Ranger lets out a gentle huff that sounds almost like quiet disappointment before stepping closer and nudging her hand with his nose. Grace finally tosses the ball toward a clearing surrounded by tall grass and scattered boulders. Ranger races after it with effortless grace, his powerful stride still carrying the confidence of a much younger dog. The peaceful moment seems untouched by anything cruel. Then the forest changes. Birds suddenly burst upward from the trees. The breeze falls strangely still. Ranger freezes halfway across the clearing, his attention fixed somewhere beyond the line of pines. Grace notices the change immediately because she has learned to trust his instincts long before trusting her own. She takes one cautious step forward, her smile fading into quiet concern. Before she can call his name, a sharp crack echoes across the valley. The sound rolls through the mountains before disappearing into heavy silence. Ranger stumbles, dropping the tennis ball into the grass as he slowly lowers himself onto the ground. Grace's heart seems to stop with him. She runs across the clearing, falling to her knees beside her faithful companion, her trembling hands searching through his thick fur as frightened tears blur her vision. Ranger looks up at her, still conscious, still trying to wag his tail despite the pain, as if his greatest concern is comforting the girl who has always depended on him. Grace whispers that everything will be all right, even though fear is tightening around every word. Somewhere beyond the trees, an engine starts. She instinctively lifts her head toward the narrow logging road hidden behind the forest. A dark pickup truck slips between the pines, disappearing almost as quickly as it appeared. She cannot see the driver's face. She cannot read the license plate. But for one brief heartbeat, sunlight flashes against a large silver ring wrapped around the driver's hand resting on the open window. The truck vanishes into the distance, leaving only dust, silence, and one question that will refuse to let Grace sleep again. Who would ever want to hurt a dog that had never given the world anything except loyalty? 1 week earlier, before fear found its way into the quiet forest, Grace Walker believes life is measured by small routines that never ask for recognition. Every morning before the sun reaches the peaks of the Montana mountains, she wakes inside the modest white farmhouse that once belonged to her parents. The old wooden floor creaks beneath her feet as she walks toward the kitchen where a faded family photograph still rests beside the coffee maker. She pauses there every day, smiling softly at 2 familiar faces she refuses to forget. Then she quietly fills Ranger's food bowl before making herself scrambled eggs and toast, because she always believes that family should eat together, even when family has become much smaller than it used to be. Ranger waits patiently until she nods with a gentle smile. Only then does he begin eating, as though good manners matter just as much as loyalty. After breakfast, Grace loads her worn backpack with schoolbooks, a sketchpad, and the camera her father once carried on hiking trips through these same mountains. Ranger walks beside her all the way to the end of the gravel driveway every school morning. He never crosses the old mailbox because years ago Grace taught him that invisible boundary, and he has never forgotten it. He simply sits there, watching until the yellow school bus disappears around the bend before slowly returning home. Every afternoon, he is already waiting in exactly the same place when she steps off the bus. Some neighbors joke that the old German Shepherd owns a better clock than anyone in town. Grace always laughs, but deep inside she believes it is something much simpler. Ranger is not waiting because he knows the time. He is waiting because he knows her. Their little town has learned to recognize them as one story instead of two separate lives. Elderly couples wave from front porches as Grace rides her bicycle through town with Ranger trotting beside her. Children ask permission to pet him outside the grocery store because everyone knows the gentle German Shepherd has endless patience. Even the mail carrier keeps dog treats inside his truck just to see Ranger's tail begin its slow, happy rhythm. There is nothing remarkable about these ordinary moments until Grace realizes one evening that ordinary moments are often the greatest gifts anyone receives. After finishing her homework, she sits beneath the wide maple tree behind the farmhouse while Ranger rests beside her with his head across her boots. She sketches the distant mountains as the last light of day paints the clouds with shades of gold and soft orange. The breeze carries the scent of pine, fresh hay, and approaching autumn while crickets begin their evening chorus across the open fields. Grace quietly tells Ranger that she wishes her parents could see how beautiful the sunset looks tonight. Ranger lifts his head, listening with those calm brown eyes that never seem to judge or question, only understand. Grace gently scratches behind his ears before whispering that she is grateful she never has to face the world alone. Ranger responds by placing one large paw across her foot, a gesture so familiar that it feels like its own language. Neither of them notices the dark pickup truck slowing almost unnoticed along the county road beyond the pasture fence. Through the windshield, someone watches the farmhouse for only a few silent seconds before driving away without leaving a trace. Grace never looks up from her drawing. Ranger briefly raises his head toward the fading sound of the engine, his ears standing alert for a moment longer than usual before the peaceful evening settles once again into quiet, leaving only the whispering wind and a feeling that something unseen has quietly entered their lives. Ranger enters Grace's life on a cold November afternoon 6 years earlier, small enough to fit inside an old flannel blanket, yet brave enough to stare at the world as though nothing could ever frighten him. The volunteer at the county animal shelter tells Grace that the tiny German Shepherd puppy has been quieter than the others, always watching instead of barking, always waiting for someone who never returned. Grace kneels on the concrete floor, reaches out her hand, and waits without speaking. After several silent seconds, the puppy slowly steps forward and rests his tiny paw against her fingers. That simple gesture changes two lonely lives forever. Since that day, Ranger grows into more than a companion. He becomes the quiet heartbeat of the Walker farmhouse, the steady presence that fills empty rooms with life after loss threatens to make every corner feel forgotten. He learns every trail through the surrounding hills, every familiar voice in town, and every emotion that crosses Grace's face long before she says a single word. When she laughs, his tail sweeps across the floor with joyful confidence. When she cries during difficult anniversaries, he simply lies beside her, offering the kind of comfort that asks for nothing in return. The people of Cedar Ridge soon begin sharing stories about the remarkable German Shepherd. Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, who lives alone at the edge of town, often tells anyone willing to listen that Ranger somehow knows exactly when she is carrying groceries too heavy for her aging hands. Without being called, he gently takes one bag by its handle and carefully walks beside her all the way to her front porch while Grace smiles with quiet embarrassment. At the elementary school playground, children gather around him after classes because Ranger accepts every gentle hug with patient dignity, never pulling away, never showing fear, as though he understands that kindness is something meant to be shared freely. Even Sheriff Daniel Morris admits that the dog has helped calm frightened travelers after unexpected car trouble on lonely mountain roads simply by sitting nearby with calm eyes and quiet confidence. No one trained Ranger to become the soul of the community. He simply chooses compassion whenever the opportunity appears. Grace often believes that people trust Ranger because he never pretends to be anything except exactly who he is. On warm summer evenings, they visit the creek where sunlight dances across the moving water and dragonflies drift through the tall grass like tiny pieces of blue glass. Grace skips smooth stones across the surface while Ranger watches floating leaves disappear beneath the current. Sometimes she reads aloud from library books because she likes imagining that someone is listening closely. Ranger always tilts his head at the sound of her voice, making every story feel important regardless of how ordinary it may be. As autumn slowly settles over the valley, Grace notices that Ranger has become more watchful than before. During their evening walks, he occasionally pauses, lifting his nose toward the wind before quietly guiding her onto a different trail without hesitation. She laughs and tells him he worries too much, gently rubbing the gray fur beginning to appear around his muzzle. Ranger looks back at her with calm eyes that seem to carry a warning she cannot yet understand. High above the trees, dark clouds begin gathering over the distant mountains while somewhere beyond the rolling hills, a truck engine echoes briefly before fading into the growing silence, unnoticed by everyone except the faithful dog who refuses to ignore what the changing wind is trying to tell him. The flashing lights of the Cedar Ridge Animal Hospital reflect across the rain-speckled windows as Grace rushes through the front doors with Ranger lying carefully on a stretcher beside two volunteer firefighters who happen to be driving near the forest trail. Every second feels impossibly long. The familiar smell of antiseptic fills the quiet lobby, while a clock somewhere behind the reception desk marks time with slow, steady clicks that seem far louder than they should. A veterinary technician gently places a reassuring hand on Grace's shoulder before leading Ranger through the swinging doors into the treatment room. Grace reaches out one last time, brushing her trembling fingers across the thick fur around his neck. Ranger lifts his tired eyes toward her for only a moment, giving the smallest movement of his tail before disappearing from sight. That single gesture becomes the only hope she has left to hold on to. Hours pass beneath pale fluorescent lights that never seem to grow warmer. Outside, evening settles over the mountains as soft rain taps against the windows like quiet prayers no one speaks aloud. Grace sits alone in the waiting room with Ranger's worn leather collar resting tightly in her hands because it had to be removed before surgery. She traces the faded stitching with her thumb, remembering the day she saved enough money from babysitting to buy it at the local feed store. It suddenly feels impossible that something so ordinary could carry so many memories. Every passing nurse offers a gentle smile, but no one has news yet. Grace closes her eyes and silently remembers every trail they have walked together, every sunrise they greeted from the old hillside, every lonely evening that Ranger somehow made bearable simply by lying beside her. At last, the treatment room door opens. Dr. Melissa Carter steps forward, her green surgical cap still in place and quiet exhaustion visible across her face. She kneels so her eyes meet Grace's. Her voice is calm, steady, and filled with compassion. She explains that Ranger survived an extremely delicate operation. The injury was serious, but the damage thankfully spared his heart and lungs. He has a difficult recovery ahead, yet he is alive. Grace exhales a breath she did not realize she had been holding and covers her face as grateful tears finally replace the fear that has gripped her since the forest fell silent. Dr. Carter gently places a small sealed evidence container into the hands of Sheriff Daniel Morris, who has quietly arrived at the hospital after receiving the emergency call. Inside rests the metal fragment carefully removed during surgery. The sheriff studies it without saying much, his expression growing more thoughtful than concerned. He slips the container into an evidence bag and quietly promises that it will be examined properly. Grace barely hears the conversation. She only wants to see Ranger. A few minutes later, she enters the recovery room, where soft monitors hum gently in the background. Ranger lies peacefully beneath a warm blanket, breathing slowly while an intravenous line delivers medicine beside him. His eyes open just enough to recognize the familiar footsteps approaching his bed. Grace smiles through fresh tears as she whispers that he kept his promise once again. He never left her. Ranger answers the only way he can, slowly pressing his nose against the edge of her hand before drifting back to sleep. Standing quietly outside the doorway, Sheriff Morris glances once more toward the sealed evidence bag in his jacket pocket. Something about the clean shape of that metal fragment refuses to feel like an accident, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he begins to wonder whether the truth waiting beyond the forest is far more complicated than anyone in Cedar Ridge is prepared to imagine. The morning after Ranger's surgery, the mountains awaken beneath a pale gray sky that seems to carry the same quiet uncertainty hanging over Cedar Ridge. Grace arrives at the animal hospital before sunrise, carrying a small blanket from home, because she knows Ranger always sleeps better with familiar scents nearby. The hallway is peaceful except for the distant hum of medical equipment and the soft footsteps of nurses beginning another day. When she enters the recovery room, Ranger is already awake. His body is still weak, but his gentle brown eyes brighten the moment he sees her. Grace smiles with relief and carefully places the blanket across the edge of his bed. Ranger rests his head against it, breathing deeply as though the scent of home reminds him that he still has something worth fighting for. Dr. Melissa Carter quietly explains that recovery will require patience, regular therapy, and plenty of rest. She also reminds Grace that dogs often heal best when surrounded by familiar voices rather than constant silence. Grace pulls a chair beside Ranger and spends the next hour reading aloud from the same adventure novel they had shared during peaceful evenings beneath the maple tree. Every few pages, Ranger slowly lifts his ears at the sound of her voice before drifting comfortably back to sleep. Meanwhile, Sheriff Daniel Morris studies the evidence collected from the forest. The carefully preserved metal fragment has already been sent for examination, but the preliminary report raises more questions than answers. Nothing about its condition suggests a random accident. Still, without witnesses or additional proof, there is little the sheriff can legally do. When he drives to the forest trail later that afternoon, the clearing appears almost unchanged. Fallen leaves continue drifting across the ground, as though nature has already begun covering the memory of that terrible afternoon. He notices faint tire tracks leading toward an old logging road, but recent rain has blurred nearly every useful detail. Standing beside the weathered trail marker, he quietly removes a small notebook and writes one sentence before closing it again. Someone was here for a reason. Across town, conversations begin spreading through coffee shops, church parking lots, and grocery store aisles. Everyone knows Ranger. Everyone struggles to believe that a dog loved by an entire community could become part of such a mystery. Some call it bad luck. Others quietly suspect there is more waiting beneath the surface. Grace hears the whispers, but chooses not to answer them. She has only one priority. Every afternoon she returns to Ranger's bedside, gently brushing his fur, speaking softly about ordinary things like changing leaves, school assignments, and the apple pie misses. Jenkins insists on baking for them when Ranger finally comes home. Those simple conversations slowly bring life back into the quiet hospital room. On the fourth evening, as sunset fills the windows with warm amber light, Ranger carefully lifts himself a little higher than before. Dr. Carter smiles with cautious optimism while making notes on his chart. Progress is slow, but it is real. As Grace reaches forward to reward him with another gentle scratch behind his ears, Ranger suddenly becomes very still. His eyes shift toward the hallway beyond the open door. His ears stand upright with complete focus. A familiar scent has drifted into the building. Grace turns instinctively, expecting to see another visitor, but only one man in a dark jacket quietly walks past the end of the corridor without looking inside the room. Ranger watches him until the footsteps disappear, and for the first time since the forest, a deep uneasiness settles silently across Grace's heart. 3 days later, Dr. Melissa Carter finally gives Grace permission to take Ranger outside for a few minutes each afternoon. The October air is crisp, carrying the clean scent of pine and damp earth after another night of gentle rain. Ranger moves slowly across the small grassy courtyard beside the hospital, every careful step reminding Grace that healing is rarely fast, but always worth believing in. She keeps one hand lightly on his harness, not because he cannot walk alone, but because they have always faced difficult roads together. Ranger pauses often, lifting his nose toward the cool breeze as though quietly reading messages hidden within the wind. His eyes remain calm, yet Grace notices something has changed. He is not simply exploring. He is searching. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Daniel Morris stops by the hospital to check on Ranger before returning to the station. Grace thanks him for everything he has done, but she can hear the hesitation in his voice when he explains that the investigation has reached another dead end. The examination of the recovered evidence confirms only that the incident did not appear accidental, but without stronger proof or a reliable witness, no formal action can move forward. Grace nods politely, yet disappointment settles heavily inside her. She remembers the silver ring she saw reflecting in the sunlight through the truck window, but a single memory is not enough to identify a stranger. After the sheriff leaves, Ranger suddenly turns his head toward the parking lot. A delivery truck has just arrived with medical supplies. The driver steps out wearing dusty work boots and carries several boxes toward the rear entrance. Ranger watches only briefly before looking away again. It is not the man that captures his attention. It is the direction from which the truck came. His ears rise. His body becomes alert despite the weakness still slowing every movement. Grace kneels beside him and gently strokes the fur along his neck. She whispers that everything is safe now, but Ranger continues staring beyond the hospital toward the distant hills where the old logging roads disappear into endless forest. 2 days later, Ranger is finally allowed to return home. The entire neighborhood seems to notice. Mrs. Jenkins leaves a homemade chicken soup on Grace's front porch with a handwritten note welcoming the brave dog back. Children from nearby houses draw colorful cards decorated with paw prints and tape them to the farmhouse mailbox. Even the mail carrier stops for a few extra minutes, just to quietly scratch Ranger behind the ears. The warmth of the community reminds Grace that kindness often grows strongest after hardship. As evening approaches, she decides to keep Dr. Carter's recommendation and take Ranger on a short, gentle walk. Instead of choosing their favorite forest trail, she follows a quiet gravel road that circles the open pasture behind the farmhouse. The setting sun paints long golden shadows across the fields while a cool breeze ripples through the dry grass. Ranger walks slowly beside her until they reach a narrow path leading toward an abandoned section of logging land that has not been used for years. Without warning, he stops. His breathing changes. His eyes lock onto the overgrown trail ahead. Then, with quiet determination that surprises even Grace, he gently pulls against the leash for the first time since leaving the hospital. He does not bark. He does not panic. He simply looks back at Grace once, as if asking her to trust him, before turning toward the forgotten path where the tall weeds sway silently above secrets that have waited far too long to be found. Grace hesitates for only a moment before loosening her grip on the leash, allowing Ranger to choose the direction for the first time since his return from the hospital. The aging German shepherd moves with careful determination along the forgotten logging trail, his pace slower than it once was but guided by quiet certainty rather than curiosity. The narrow path is almost hidden beneath waist-high grass and fallen branches that have not been disturbed for years. Evening sunlight filters through tall pines, casting long ribbons of gold across the forest floor, while a cool breeze carries the scent of cedar, damp leaves, and distant rain. Grace follows closely behind, saying nothing because she has learned that Ranger never acts without reason. Every few yards he pauses, lifts his nose into the wind, and continues deeper into the silent woods. The farther they walk, the quieter everything becomes. Even the usual songs of birds seem to fade away until only the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet remains. Nearly half a mile from the main road, Ranger suddenly stops beside a rusted fence post leaning at an awkward angle. Thick blackberry vines have nearly swallowed the old boundary marker, leaving only a weathered strand of wire visible beneath tangled branches. Ranger studies the ground with complete focus before gently beginning to scrape away layers of damp leaves using one front paw. Grace kneels beside him, brushing aside loose soil with her hands, expecting perhaps an old toy or forgotten piece of farm equipment. Instead, her fingers strike solid metal. She carefully clears away the remaining dirt until the corner of a small steel lockbox appears beneath the earth. Time and moisture have stained its surface with rust, yet the lid remains tightly sealed. Grace stares at it in confusion. There is no reason a locked box should be buried this far from any house or road. Ranger steps back without touching it again, quietly watching her as though his task has already been completed. Grace takes several photographs with her father's old camera before carefully lifting the surprisingly heavy box from the ground. As she turns it over, she notices faded black lettering almost hidden beneath years of corrosion. The first word is no longer readable, but the second word remains clear enough to recognize. Hale. The name sends an unexpected chill through her. Victor Hale owns thousands of acres surrounding Cedar Ridge, including abandoned logging property stretching across these hills. She has heard the name her entire life. Most people speak it with polite respect. Others lower their voices before mentioning it at all. Grace wraps the box inside her jacket and hurries home with Ranger walking quietly beside her. After placing the lockbox on the kitchen table, she telephones Sheriff Daniel Morris and asks if he can come immediately. Less than 20 minutes later, his patrol truck pulls into the driveway. He studies the photographs first, then carefully examines the box without attempting to force it open. His expression grows noticeably more serious when he sees the partially visible name pressed into the rusted metal. He quietly explains that anything discovered under these circumstances must be processed properly to preserve whatever evidence may still remain inside. As he seals the lockbox inside an official evidence container, Ranger continues watching from the living room doorway without making a sound. Sheriff Morris glances toward the faithful German shepherd before looking back at Grace. In a calm voice barely louder than the ticking kitchen clock, he says that sometimes the smallest clue changes everything. Outside, darkness settles across the Montana hills, but for the first time since that terrible afternoon in the forest, the silence no longer feels empty. It feels as though the truth has finally begun walking toward them. The following morning, a blanket of silver mist hangs over Cedar Ridge as though the mountains themselves are waiting for answers. Grace stands on the farmhouse porch with a mug of hot chocolate warming her hands while Ranger rests quietly beside her, watching the sunrise spill across fields covered with dew. The peaceful view feels strangely different now. Every familiar place seems to be hiding a story that no one has been willing to tell. Just after 8 o'clock, Sheriff Daniel Morris calls and asks Grace to meet him at the station. His voice remains calm, but she immediately senses that something important has changed. Ranger rises before she even reaches for his leash, as if he already knows they are about to take another step toward the truth. Inside the sheriff's office, the atmosphere is unusually quiet. A single evidence box rests on the conference table beside several neatly organized photographs and old property maps. Sheriff Morris explains that technicians successfully opened the rusted lockbox without damaging its contents. Inside, they discovered handwritten maintenance records, several dated photographs, and a small ledger documenting equipment stored on Victor Hale's abandoned logging property years earlier. Most of the papers appear ordinary at first glance, but one page immediately captures the sheriff's attention. It lists several vehicle identification numbers along with dates that do not match official county records. Grace does not fully understand what the numbers mean, but she recognizes the concern in the sheriff's expression. Before he can continue, another knock echoes through the office door. An elderly man slowly steps inside, removing his faded baseball cap with weathered hands. Sheriff Morris introduces him as Thomas Bennett, a retired forestry worker who spent more than 30 years maintaining trails throughout the surrounding mountains. Thomas quietly admits that he almost turned around before reaching the station because he has carried a burden for far too long. His voice trembles as he explains that on the afternoon Ranger was injured, he had been repairing an old drainage ditch less than a quarter-mile away. He remembers hearing an unexpected sharp sound roll across the valley. Moments later, he saw a dark pickup truck leaving the old logging road much faster than vehicles usually traveled there. At the time, he thought little of it because he did not realize anything terrible had happened nearby. Then he pauses, lowering his eyes toward the floor before continuing. As the truck passed, sunlight reflected brightly from the driver's hand resting on the open window. A large silver ring caught his attention because he had seen that same distinctive ring many times before during community events. It belonged to Victor Hale. Silence settles across the room. No one rushes to speak. Sheriff Morris carefully writes every detail into his notebook before asking only a few simple questions to confirm the timeline. Thomas answers each one with quiet confidence, explaining that guilt has followed him every day since learning what happened to Ranger. He says he should have come forward sooner, but feared no one would believe an old man speaking against the wealthiest landowner in the county. Grace gently thanks him for finding the courage now. Thomas smiles sadly and kneels beside Ranger, who calmly rests his head against the old man's knee without hesitation. Sheriff Morris quietly closes the evidence folder and looks toward the window where the morning fog is finally beginning to lift from the valley. The pieces no longer stand alone. For the first time since the investigation began, they are beginning to fit together, and somewhere beyond the clearing where one faithful dog refused to surrender, the silence protecting the truth has finally started to break. The news spreads through Cedar Ridge with the quiet speed that only small towns understand. No headlines appear. No television cameras arrive. Instead, conversations begin over steaming coffee at the diner, beside shelves at the grocery store, and beneath the white steeple after Sunday service. People who have remained silent for years suddenly find themselves looking at one another differently. They begin remembering small details that once seemed unimportant. Sheriff Daniel Morris spends the following days carefully reviewing every statement, every property record, and every photograph recovered from the lockbox. Each new piece of information strengthens the same conclusion. Nothing alone proves the entire story, but together they form a pattern that can no longer be ignored. Grace continues focusing on Ranger's recovery, refusing to let hope turn into anger. Every morning they walk a little farther than the day before. The autumn leaves now blanket the narrow country roads in shades of crimson, amber, and gold, filling the cool air with the earthy scent of changing seasons. Ranger still moves carefully, but his confidence quietly returns with every passing sunrise. During one afternoon walk near the edge of Victor Hale's property, Ranger suddenly pauses beside an old wooden fence. His ears lift toward a weathered utility pole where a small metal security camera has remained almost invisible beneath overgrown vines. Grace stops beside him and studies the forgotten device. It looks abandoned, its protective cover faded by years of harsh Montana winters, yet something about its position feels intentional. She immediately telephones Sheriff Morris instead of touching anything herself. Less than an hour later, deputies arrive along with a county evidence technician. After carefully examining the camera, they discover that although its external power supply had failed months earlier, the unit contains an internal memory card designed to preserve recorded footage. The technician removes it with deliberate care before sealing it inside an evidence envelope. Everyone waits in complete silence. Later that evening, inside the sheriff's office, the recovered recordings begin playing across a computer monitor. Much of the footage contains nothing more than deer crossing the trail, blowing snow, or empty stretches of forgotten logging road. Then the date reaches the afternoon when Grace and Ranger entered the forest. A dark pickup truck slowly appears, traveling toward the clearing at nearly the exact time Thomas Bennett described. The driver's face remains partially hidden beneath the angle of the windshield, but one unmistakable detail catches every eye in the room. As the truck passes beneath direct sunlight, the driver's left hand rests casually on the open window, wearing a large silver ring that flashes brightly for several seconds before the vehicle disappears beyond the trees. Sheriff Morris quietly pauses the recording and compares the image with photographs collected during previous community events. The distinctive ring matches perfectly. Grace watches without speaking. She feels no satisfaction, only a deep sadness that the truth has required so much pain before revealing itself. Sheriff Morris carefully closes the evidence folder and contacts the county prosecutor, explaining that the investigation now includes physical evidence, documented records, a credible witness, and independently recovered video supporting the same timeline. For the first time since that quiet afternoon in the forest, the law finally has enough to move forward. Ranger slowly walks across the office and rests beside Grace's chair, placing his head gently against her knee. She runs her fingers through the familiar black and tan fur and realizes that the faithful dog who could not speak has nevertheless guided every important step toward the truth. Outside, the last light of day settles across Cedar Ridge, and the mountains stand silent beneath the evening sky, as though they have been patiently waiting all along for justice to find its own way home. The county courthouse stands quietly beneath a clear Montana sky as golden leaves drift across its stone steps, reminding everyone that even the longest seasons eventually change. Grace arrives early with Ranger walking calmly beside her, his steady pace no longer marked by hesitation, but by quiet strength earned through patience and healing. People gathered outside greet them with gentle smiles instead of curious whispers. The story that once belonged only to one frightened girl and her faithful dog has slowly become something the entire community carries together. Inside the courtroom, sunlight streams through tall windows, filling the room with a warm glow that softens the weight of the day ahead. Sheriff Daniel Morris sits beside the county prosecutor with neatly organized evidence spread across the table. Every photograph, every written record recovered from the buried lockbox, every statement, and every carefully preserved piece of physical evidence has been arranged with deliberate precision. Across the room, Victor Hale enters surrounded by legal counsel. He carries the same quiet confidence that has followed him for years, greeting familiar faces with polite nods, as though this morning is little different from any other. Grace notices one detail immediately. The large silver ring still rests on his left hand, catching the sunlight exactly as it had in the forest. She lowers her eyes toward Ranger instead of looking at Victor any longer. Bitterness would only give fear another place to live. The proceedings begin calmly. Witnesses speak one after another, each contributing a small piece of a story that had remained hidden for far too long. Thomas Bennett quietly repeats what he saw from the old logging road. The county evidence technician explains how the forgotten security camera preserved footage despite losing external power months before. Dr. Melissa Carter confirms the careful preservation of the medical evidence recovered during Ranger's surgery and explains the importance of maintaining an unbroken chain of custody. Sheriff Morris then presents the recovered video. The courtroom falls completely silent as the recording plays across the large monitor. The dark pickup truck appears exactly as before, traveling along the abandoned road. Moments later, sunlight reflects brilliantly from the driver's hand resting outside the open window. The image pauses. The silver ring fills the screen. Without raising his voice, the prosecutor places several enlarged photographs from community events beside the frozen video frame. Every distinctive detail aligns with remarkable consistency. The room remains still. No dramatic outburst follows. No one celebrates. Truth rarely arrives with noise. It simply stands where denial can no longer remain. Victor slowly lowers his eyes as the weight of the evidence settles over the courtroom. His attorneys quietly request a recess before continuing. Grace sits motionless with one hand resting gently on Ranger's shoulders. The faithful German shepherd leans against her leg with complete trust, unaware of legal arguments or courtroom procedure, knowing only that the frightened girl he has always protected no longer carries the burden alone. Several hours later, the court formally acknowledges that sufficient evidence exists for the case to proceed under the law. As people begin leaving the courtroom, no applause fills the halls. Instead, neighbors quietly approach Grace with gentle words, warm embraces, and grateful smiles. Sheriff Morris pauses beside her before walking toward the courthouse doors. He looks back only once and says that justice is never measured by how loudly it arrives, but by how faithfully the truth endures. Grace watches the afternoon sunlight spill across the courthouse steps as Ranger walks beside her into the cool autumn air. For the first time since that peaceful afternoon in the forest was shattered, she realizes that healing does not begin when fear disappears. It begins the moment truth no longer has to walk alone. The weeks that follow bring a different kind of change to Cedar Ridge, one that cannot be measured by court documents or newspaper stories, but by the quiet choices ordinary people begin making every day. The conversations that once ended with uncertain whispers now end with grateful silence. Neighbors who had spent years keeping to themselves begin stopping at one another's front porches again. The old diner fills with familiar laughter during breakfast. Children ride their bicycles farther into the evening without their parents carrying quite the same weight of worry. It is as though the town has remembered something it almost forgot, that truth has a way of restoring more than justice alone. Grace notices the difference during her morning walks with Ranger. The gravel roads feel the same beneath their feet. The mountains still rise proudly beyond the valley, and the crisp autumn air still carries the scent of pine and fresh hay. yet every greeting now seems warmer than before. Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins waits beside her mailbox each Tuesday with homemade treats for Ranger, insisting that heroes deserve proper rewards even if they have 4 legs instead of 2. The mail carrier still keeps dog biscuits inside his truck, but now he smiles a little longer before continuing his route. Children who once admired Ranger from a distance now gather around him after school, gently scratching behind his ears while listening to Grace tell stories about patience, kindness, and never giving up on those you love. Ranger accepts every gentle hand with the same quiet dignity that has always defined him. He never seeks attention. He simply offers comfort wherever it is needed. One Saturday afternoon, the Cedar Ridge Community Center organizes a small gathering to thank everyone who helped throughout the difficult weeks. Folding tables line the grassy park beneath tall cottonwood trees, while local families bring homemade pies, fresh bread, and steaming pots of chili. There are no speeches planned, yet Sheriff Daniel Morris eventually steps forward holding nothing more than a simple wooden plaque carved by a local craftsman. He kneels beside Ranger and gently places the plaque before him. Burned into the polished wood are only a few words. Faithful hearts change communities. Applause rises softly across the park, not loud enough to overwhelm the quiet beauty of the moment, but warm enough to fill every heart standing beneath the golden leaves. Grace feels tears gathering again, though these are no longer tears of fear. They are tears born from gratitude. She thanks everyone with a humble smile, explaining that Ranger never set out to become an example. He only did what love had taught him to do every single day. As the afternoon continues, Thomas Bennett slowly approaches carrying an old leather leash folded carefully over one arm. He explains that it once belonged to the search dog who worked beside him decades earlier in the same mountains. He asks Grace to keep it, saying that courage deserves to be remembered from one generation to the next. Grace accepts the gift with both hands, understanding that some legacies are passed not through wealth, but through quiet acts of trust. Ranger gently sniffs the weathered leather before looking up at Thomas with calm eyes that seem to understand more than words could ever express. As the sun begins settling behind the Montana peaks, families slowly return home while long shadows stretch peacefully across the park. Grace watches Ranger walking among neighbors who now greet him not simply as a remarkable dog, but as a reminder that even the smallest act of loyalty can awaken the very best inside an entire community. And standing beneath the fading autumn sky, she realizes that while justice may have opened the door, compassion is what truly brought everyone home. Winter arrives quietly in Cedar Ridge, covering the mountains with fresh snow that sparkles beneath pale morning sunlight, like countless tiny stars resting upon the earth. The familiar farmhouse feels warmer than ever as wood crackles inside the old stone fireplace, while the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread drifts through every room. Ranger has regained his strength little by little. Although a faint stiffness remains in his stride on especially cold mornings, his spirit has never been stronger. Grace often smiles as she watches him trot across the snowy yard, leaving a trail of perfect paw prints that disappear only when another gentle snowfall begins. The difficult months have changed both of them, not by taking away their memories, but by teaching them what those memories could become. Inspired by the kindness that carried them through their darkest days, Grace begins spending weekends volunteering at the county animal shelter where Ranger first entered her life years before. At first, she simply helps clean kennels, refill food bowls, and comfort frightened animals waiting for families of their own. Ranger quietly follows her through every hallway, lying patiently beside nervous dogs until their trembling slowly fades. The shelter staff soon notice that anxious animals settle more quickly whenever Ranger is nearby. His calm presence asks for nothing, yet somehow gives reassurance without a single sound. Children visiting the shelter naturally gather around him before meeting the other dogs, and their laughter slowly fills rooms that once echoed only with uncertainty. Dr. Melissa Carter occasionally visits the shelter to perform wellness examinations, smiling every time she sees Ranger greeting another frightened animal with the same gentle patience that helped heal Grace's own heart. Sheriff Daniel Morris also stops by one snowy afternoon, carrying several donated blankets collected by deputies throughout the county. Looking around at volunteers working side by side, He quietly remarks that sometimes the greatest victories never appear inside a courtroom. Grace understands exactly what he means. Justice had protected the truth, but compassion is what continues changing lives long after legal papers are filed away. As spring approaches, the shelter launches a new community outreach program encouraging responsible pet ownership and supporting families facing financial hardship so beloved companions never have to lose their homes because of temporary struggles. Grace eagerly volunteers to speak at local schools about kindness, responsibility, and the lifelong promise that comes with caring for an animal. She never describes Ranger as a hero. Instead, she tells children that love becomes extraordinary only because someone chooses to practice it every ordinary day. Ranger quietly lies beside her during every presentation, accepting gentle pats from curious students while reminding everyone that trust is built one peaceful moment at a time. One afternoon, after finishing another school visit, Grace notices a young boy standing alone outside the gymnasium, holding the leash of a shy rescue puppy. The boy admits he worries that he is not brave enough to care for such a frightened dog. Grace kneels beside him with a reassuring smile and invites Ranger forward. The old German shepherd slowly lowers himself until the little puppy cautiously steps closer and gently touches noses with him. The puppy's tail begins to wag for the very first time. The boy laughs with quiet relief, and Grace realizes that hope has a remarkable way of passing from one heart to another without asking permission. As the afternoon sun melts the last patches of winter snow across the schoolyard, Ranger walks beside Grace toward the waiting truck, leaving behind not only footprints in the soft earth, but countless small moments of courage that will continue growing inside people they may never even meet again. 1 year later, the first warm afternoon of September returns to the Montana mountains with the same gentle breeze that once carried fear through the pines, yet everything feels different now. Grace parks her old pickup beside the familiar trailhead and steps onto the narrow forest path, with Ranger walking peacefully at her side. His muzzle has grown a little grayer, and his pace is slower than it used to be, but every step still carries the quiet confidence that first taught a lonely girl how to believe in tomorrow. Sunlight filters through the towering trees, painting soft patterns across the forest floor, while the scent of pine, wildflowers, and fresh earth fills the cool air. The creek below continues its endless journey over smooth stones, sounding exactly as it did before sorrow ever visited this place. Grace pauses near the clearing where their lives changed forever. For a long moment, she simply closes her eyes and listens. The wind moves gently through the branches. Birds sing without fear. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circles high above the valley. The silence no longer feels heavy. It feels welcoming. Ranger slowly walks ahead before stopping in the center of the clearing. He looks back at Grace with the same calm eyes that have always carried more comfort than words ever could. She kneels beside him, wrapping one arm gently around his neck while resting her forehead against his soft fur. She quietly thanks him for never giving up, for leading her toward the truth when she could no longer see the path herself, and for reminding her that courage is often gentle instead of loud. Ranger answers the only way he knows, pressing his nose lightly against her shoulder before sitting beside her beneath the warm afternoon sun. They remain there for several peaceful minutes without speaking because some moments become complete only when silence is allowed to finish the story. Before leaving, Grace reaches into her backpack and removes a small wooden sign she carved herself during the previous winter. She carefully places it beside the old trail marker near the entrance to the clearing. The simple message burned into the smooth cedar wood reads, "Walk with kindness. Every life matters." There are no names beneath the words because she wants every traveler who passes this place to see themselves inside the message. As they begin walking back toward the trailhead, a young family enters the forest from the opposite direction with 2 children and a recently adopted rescue dog, still learning to trust unfamiliar places. The nervous dog hesitates for only a moment before noticing Ranger. The old German shepherd calmly approaches, lowering his head with quiet patience until the younger dog cautiously steps forward. Within seconds, both dogs begin walking together as though they have known each other for years. The children laugh with pure delight, while their parents smile with grateful relief. Grace watches the simple encounter unfold and realizes that healing has a remarkable way of continuing long after people believe a story has ended. As the afternoon light slowly turns golden across the mountains, Grace and Ranger leave the forest together, their shadows stretching side by side along the quiet path. Behind them, the clearing remains peaceful beneath the whispering pines, no longer remembered as the place where hope was almost lost, but as the place where faith quietly chose to remain. Some journeys are not remembered because they ended without pain. They are remembered because love refused to surrender, and in doing so, gently changed every heart it touched.